So today I'll be talking a little bit more about compliance, data governance, and protection for SaaS solutions in AWS space. I know it does sound a little bit mouthful, but we will try to kind of deconstruct that and kind of go through all the different aspects of that running your workloads in AWS. So again, my name is Marko Belc. I'm a senior consultant working at the Scale Factory. We were founded in 2009, and we are a remote-first AWS consultancy, working mostly with SaaS businesses. We are also launch partners for well-architected reviews and SaaS competency. And as I said before, we're going to talk a little bit more about compliance and how this kind of applies to SaaS businesses such as yourselves. I believe there's going to be some talk at some time at the end of this talk for additional questions. But if you find yourselves lost or I'm going too quick or making no sense, please stop me at any time. I'm happy to stop at any time and we can discuss questions as we go along. Okay, so let's start with compliance then, right? So if we look at the compliance from a really kind of high level overview, like what compliance is, what's involved, what are different factors, we can probably kind of decompose the compliance into there are some regulations that you need to adhere to. Motivation might be quite obvious, specifically if you have clear business needs or you're kind of need to do regular reviews, specifically if you work in highly regulated industries. And for example, there might be legal and statutory obligations that you need to kind of comply with as well, as I said before. But if not, you probably need to understand the overall aim. So the reason why you're doing that, what are the standards that you need to kind of comply with, which policies you need to apply, and of course, what governance that offer you in a sense of how you're delivering your product and how your services are made available to your customers and tenants. So mechanism might be well defined. So like I said before, if there are normative standards such as PCI DSS or ISO, the mechanisms are well defined. But more often, you usually, get to chart your own route to compliance. So, there is no kind of one right way of doing it. And it really depends what kind of space you're currently working in. Let's kind of dig into that a little bit more, right? So what is compliance? Let's kind of try to formalize that a little bit more. So compliance, like I said before, it's literally adhering to a rule such as policy, standard, specification, or law, and it can be regulatory, and it actually means that there are actually more or less clear guidelines or rules that you need to follow, and usually, this is most common, you have to or you should be able to show this if asked for. So, for example, if you're PCI DSS compliant and working in a financial sector and financial space, you might be, or you're probably going to be questioned about it to kind of, show that or demonstrate that you're compliant with the PCI DSS standard. And obviously, if you want to be compliant, usually part of being compliant is also the audit process, which is usually part of the regulations or part of your internal company structure or processes that you introduce as well. Like I mentioned before, I already mentioned there are many standards and frameworks and regulations. So for example, I mentioned PCI DSS. There is also some more kind of US specific ones. But in general, there is NIST, FIPS, ISO standards such as 27001, 27017, 27018, which define the security, cloud security, and cloud privacy. And then obviously the GDPR, since I'm assuming most of the people joining in today operate, or at least, if they're not based in Europe, at least they're kind of collaborating with European customers at some point. Then the GXP and HIPPA and SOC 2 and similar ones. So Operating within the established guidelines or regulations is actually being capable of demonstrating that and going past through the regular audits or reviews of that. So what does actually compliance mean to you as a SaaS business, right? You might ask yourself that question, or you might already be on a path to being compliant. So like I said before, it might be industry sector requirement. It might mean that it will give you additional, competitive edge over competitors on your market. So it doesn't mean it's your obligatory thing you have to do, but it will give you the edge between the competitors, since you might be tendering for the same kind of deals. But if you're compliant, that probably means that you're going to be favored in one way or another. It can simplify sales and tenant onboarding if you have clear processes and compliance with specific standards. It may even, be a new way to enter market segments that would be otherwise inaccessible. Or, you can foster trust with your customers as well. So, for example, people tend to get ISO standards to kind of foster trust and build a relationship with their clients based on the internationally kind of recognized standards and guidelines. And of course, last but not the least, it can also align with one of your company values or goals that you set out to achieve as well, to kind of improve your reputation in the market space as well. But regardless which category you fall into or which kind of topics you kind of now kind of nodded to or kind of felt like matches your compliance recognition. By being compliant also means that at some point you want to also manage your data governance successfully, and usually being compliant with most of the standards that I mentioned before usually kind of not implies, but at least gets you on the good path to getting your data governance documented well and sorted your processes around there. So as we all know, nowadays companies, specifically SaaS businesses, tends to harvest and collect a lot of data and process that data, usually with some AI or machine learning. And the goal here is, as this big chunk of data is processed, we need to be careful, specifically if we are capturing personally identifiable information, PII, and we have to kind of keep in mind as well that usually that's not even a requirement to kind of make some sensible value out of data that you harvest. So bear in mind that also the anonymized and de-identified data can also help providing you with value and also lowering risks that it might hold against your customers or the industry standards as well. So to summarize, there are multiple drivers for effective governance of your data. First of all, you need to retain customer trust. As I mentioned before, this kind of nicely relates back to the compliance that we talked. It protects sensitive data. And then, of course, the need to comply with the privacy laws. And this is kind of, I wouldn't say forcefully, but it's usually enforced down on you from the either industry standards or industry regulations or like general regulations for maybe a country that you're operating in. Okay, now we kind of define, what are the drivers, what is the idea behind compliance, what it kind of means to you, and how you can govern your data. But there is also a question of information security as well, which I think it kind of tightly, relates to those kind of topics. So let's first define what security is, right? So security is, by definition, a state of being secure from danger or threat, which might seem very trivial or straightforward thing to do, but I'm sure most of you on this call would agree that that is usually not an easy task. And there are definitely aspects of that that are easily, overseen or mistreated as we implement our solutions. So information security definitely should aim to automate the security. So the focus can actually shift on scaling and innovating rather than, actively thinking about it. So by information security, I mean, it should be part of your SaaS solution and focus from day one. But at the same time, it should definitely be built in from every aspect of building your solution, delivering into the market. And absolutely, AWS can help you with that, with using the services and solutions that are offered as part of the AWS cloud. And with the information security, we're trying to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your data. And most of all, in a kind of a SaaS space, your tenants' data. After all, this is your butter and bread. So if you quickly look at the compliance versus the information security, the security controls that can help you meet the compliance obligations. This is literally kind of what we would define compliance through the information security. So security can be seen as a subset or a tool to achieve compliance. And as part of the compliance and achieving information security, there are some key details that needs to be documented. For example, like threat modeling or data classification policy. So when we define information security and compliance in that arena, what we also need to do, we need to ensure that people have clear roles and responsibilities with the necessary training involved. And this is something that tends to be put on a sidetrack usually, where as soon as people become compliant, they kind of forget that training people and keeping them up to date with the compliances or compliance standards is also a key factor achieving successful compliance audits. So we also need to define processes to avoid ambiguity. So that means that processes need to be clear, they need to be well documented, and foremost, they're here to kind of lower the formal risk. And as part of that, we need to have a risk assessment process in place as well to control any kind of deviations or things that might happen along the way. Because after all, being compliant is not a static thing. It's definitely something that you need to come back over and over again. And usually there are regular kind of scheduled audits or recertifications that you would need to do anyway. Right. So let's quickly have a look at the compliance implementation drivers. So at this point, I would like us to focus a little bit more on the factor or what would influence your decision making and how you approach the compliance goals specifically. So, it should definitely involve your growth strategy. So as part of your company strategy to grow and expand on the market, maybe you have a timeline to enter the specific market segment that you want to, tap into. And at that point, you need to be compliant. That's why it's really important to have this in mind when you're creating and coming up with your growth strategies. Then the next bit is, you might need to be regulated because of the industry you operate in. So specifically, if you work in a highly regulated industry such as, pharmaceuticals or food industries or health, that's usually quite highly regulated. And of course, you want to ensure security from the start. As I said before, it shouldn't be optional. It should be built in, and it should be automated as much as possible. And you might even be required, or you need to accommodate some legacy architecture as well. So as you evolve, develop new features, there might be some legacy architecture or external systems. As we heard in previous talk, maybe there are external payment providers that you need to communicate with, and that's why you actually need to be compliant as well. Whereas you as a company might not be required as such. And of course, another driver might be, of course, the price, right? This is usually what kind of drives, or at least has the final say in decision making. So you might be focused on marginal cost of adding a tenant or on a total cost of ownership that being compliant might actually add to be honest. So as part of reaching compliance and looking at the implementation drivers, part of that process is definitely assessing risk. So like I said before, it's a continuous process that you need to kind of always come back to and always compare how things change and how those things reflect to what you have found out with your last review that might be in the previous annum. Part of the assessing risk is also accepting specific edge cases. So it's not always about eliminating risk or avoiding it, but sometimes you actually also accept that the risk is there and you think the risk is acceptable and you're are prepared to face it in specific edge cases. In other situations, you might want to mitigate or plan for the mitigation if that happens. And even more so if you are kind of an early startup, usually you might be even willing to postpone some of the implementation of your compliance in order to maybe get to market faster or deliver your product to your customers sooner. And then as you reach that, you probably kind of schedule or set some time aside or resources to implement the compliance as needed to kind of grow either furthermore. So it doesn't actually have to be implemented immediately, but definitely something to keep in mind as you grow. So that naturally kind of raises the question at this point, right? Where when to start your compliance project, when to start implementing it, because the key factors to consider is, have you been maybe focusing too much on features, not so much on compliance? If so, what are actually the consequences of that? And what is your compliance depth here? So in similar manner as the technical depth, you can identify compliance depth as well, where you intentionally postpone it for a specific bit to kind of, implement other bits or do other activities. If doing so, did you track compliance gaps as issues not being picked up? So that's kind of an important question at this point as well that we see in our customers, dealing with quite a lot. And of course, definitely a good practice here is to use a size of backlog to gauge risk to revenue / reputation. So, it should always be manageable, but at the same time, it should be, still mitigating through risk that, at some point you can actually go and implement that. And of course, if you are already compliant, but assessed in a really early phase, which is usually much simpler to demonstrate compliance in rather than later on, definitely plan enough time to retain compliance now and when service is more mature. And what people tend to forget at this stage is it gets more complicated as you go along in your path, and as soon as you're end up in a later phase of your product, getting compliance is much more tedious and probably much more time consuming than it is usually in the early stages. So definitely plan for that time and resources accordingly. So another thing to kind of keep in mind as well, if you're growing into markets that expect compliance, it usually takes much longer than you think. So definitely allow time to prototype and size the remaining work accordingly, and maybe even put aside some time as a reserve or a backup, because it's definitely something that people usually run out for. So in this kind of aspect, kind of looking at the when to start a compliant project, or how to position it within the kind of phases of companies. Let's have a more kind of an in-detail look of how to actually position that within the funding timeframe or development timeframe of SaaS businesses. So let's stop for a bit and talk a little bit about crossing the chasm. I'm not sure if people on this call are all familiar with this, but this curve is a classic adoption curve for an innovation. And it was kind of described in detail in Jeffrey Moore's book, which is, I think the title is actually Selling Text Products. during the startup period. I think it was shortened later on. But what it kind of tries to depict, and Jeffrey kind of goes into much detail and describes those stages, is, there are different stages of your product and your company that you hit the market. So usually it starts with a minimum feature set, as you can see here on the left. And you have some innovators or some early adopters that kind of onboard your product, start testing it, see how it works. But you still haven't reached the point where you can say, we reached the critical mass when our product is really viable or sustainable at that point, right? So you would go through all the phases, like choosing the target market, understand the product, then positioning it somewhere, developing the marketing strategy, and then distribution and pricing at the end of it, as soon as you onboard enough customers and you expand your business beyond the early stages. And what is important as well is, when you're trying to reach the broader market, typically means removing the adoption barriers. What I usually ask our clients here, and the question that poses almost itself is, is the compliance and data governance one of those key barriers? Because if you look at that graph here and the diagram, you see as soon as you reach the early adopters, there is intentional a little bit of a gap in there. And that gap actually means there are significant bits that you need to do to kind of jump from early adopters and start onboarding the early majority. And this is where you need to invest a lot of resources into reaching whole product solution, where you would offer almost a full feature set to kind of start onboarding the majority, and where the full expansion starts to happen. And at this point, you probably want to have at least basic kind of compliance and data governance in place, because at this point you would definitely be seeing different barriers to enter specific markets if you're not compliant at this point. And if we add additional kind of dimension to this graph as well, is what you would usually see through the funding is all the way up to the gap. You would usually kind of have this runway kind of funded from the seed or fund or venture capital, depending how you're financed. And then at that point, you need to kind of prove before you increase your growth furthermore and try to kind of get more funding, such as A, B, C, D series, or whatever funding you're going for. You definitely need to prove that you're compliant, you're able to expand, and you're able to tap into markets that you kind of MVP with innovator phase and initial phase, right? So keeping that finance model in mind is definitely relevant too. And if you're adding external capital, being compliant and proving that to your investors is definitely an important factor, and one of the things to kind of that can drive your compliance story forward as well. So, as I said, is compliance an investment case? So, as SaaS businesses, you probably need to evaluate how does that fit into your growth plan, and entering the market and what the current value of compliance is, because depending on which market you operate with, maybe the compliance is not the main driver. Maybe the main drivers is are something else, like reaching your customers or ensuring security, but not being compliant with some official kind of compliance standard. So definitely taking the pragmatical approach and carefully timing of your implementation is definitely a recommendation here. So you shouldn't start too early. You should be really pragmatical. Like I said, you might do the initial compliance review early on, where it's easy to achieve compliance, but you should, as I said before, properly schedule that and time it later on in the later phases as well, to get compliant and reviewed and audited when you hit the full feature set, which is usually much harder and much more involved, with much more stakeholders involved, where when you grow as a company, you usually add more people, there are more processes involved, and so on. But the bottom line is I think my personal opinion is compliance is there to protect all parties, and it also acts usually as a power equalizer. So it protects you as a company, or not just against the competition, but also against malicious activity in the market, but also protects the other side as well. So your customers and your tenants, where they're usually in different position of power, where in terms of their personal data or data they deliver to you and expect some value out of it. So when you onboard on the road of compliance, there are usually some significant and related changes to the how you operate in your organization. So during the implementation project, the internal processes might change or align with the compliance kind of rules or policies. And as we all know, the Conway's law usually works quite well in these situations. So if you're not familiar with the Conway's law, what it actually states is that the communicational structure of organization usually matches the design patterns and operations that takes. So for example, the way how you communicate usually reflects in how you develop products or how they internally operate as well. And being compliant usually affects those processes as well. It also affects your teams, how they operate, how they communicate, and it affects the change chain or change control as well, and also how you deliver value. And what's important to keep in mind as well is there might be some changes about how you isolate your data, specifically in SaaS businesses. I know that my colleague Tim has been talking about the tenant isolation, I think last week, and I think that's an important kind of aspect here as well, is in multi-tenancy, how do you isolate your data and how do you reach compliance from that perspective? Because you're not serving a single client. There are different kind of boundaries that you have to take into place, and how to actually keep compliance up in order to satisfy all the requirements from the standards. So that brings us to few kind of client stories that I would like to share today. So those are the clients that we worked in the past. I would like to briefly touch 3 client stories. So the first one is about a Pharma SaaS startup. They started up as a fairly small company. I believe it was 4 people. They have like 800K initial capital. And what they actually did is they found a new way how to automate key processes that involve the patient data reporting and how that can commercially be viable to big pharma companies. So they were start doing reporting of the side effects of drugs for the end customers for big pharma companies. And themselves, they didn't need to kind of adhere to any kind of specific compliance standards or any kind of different regulations, but because they wanted to operate in a highly regulated industry such as pharmaceuticals, and in order to enter that market, they actually needed to be compliant with a lot of standards. So they have reached the GXP compliancy. So if you're not familiar, GXP is an acronym that refers to regulations and guidelines applicable to life sciences organizations that make food and medical products. So that typically means drugs, medical devices, medical software applications, and so on. And the overall intent of that standard is to ensure that the food and medical products are safe for consumers, and to ensure the integrity of data that is used as part of that process. So they actually need to go through the quite strict, audit process to achieve that. But the challenges were also the target market accustomed to go through the target market accustomed here is to go through the thorough paperwork. And what we help them with is to achieve the same automation through the services available through AWS, and also automate the processes as much as possible to generate the paperwork and satisfy the audits they're going through. The existing frameworks that they operate in are, or they're probably still poor fit for SaaS delivery model, and that's why there was quite a big struggle to deliver the multi-tenancy solution, specifically because there are high regulations and auditors are quite strict about the data isolation. But they actually managed to, achieve that, and they're currently running multi-tenant solutions successfully. And heavily compliance requirements, or they actually had a really heavy compliance requirements in order to enter the market. So because they wanted to enter that market, they needed to get compliant really early on, and they need to keep compliant as they go as well. So as I said, automation, additional logging, and built-in guardrails from the ground up really get them there and help them to achieve that with help of AWS and also the AWS partners such as ourselves and our colleagues on this call as well. So the second story, client story that I want to show or briefly discuss is a different kind of industry. It's an entertainment industry and a company that was offering a SaaS solution in that arena. So they were a streaming provider, and they were trying to kind of offer a complete end-to-end video solution. For example, like in hotels for customers going to hotel rooms, and the hotel would deliver them a video content on demand. So you can imagine that as maybe as a Netflix in a hotel, right? But the tricky bit here is what they were trying to do is, and please bear in mind, this actually is still time before the smartphone apps got popular. So they were trying to deliver that through a remote controls and TV sets only. And as you can imagine, using a public device such as TV in a hotel room and a remote control is definitely going to be a lot of effort and work to make it compliant, specifically because they were doing payments. They needed to be PCI DSS compliant, and in order to achieve that, it would be really hard to achieve that. So with our help, what they ended up doing actually is, instead of using that, they kind of flipped it around a bit. So they started generating QR codes, which you would use in order to be redirected or use an external payment provider such as Stripe. And that would actually delegate some of the responsibilities and compliance requirements away from them. And in order to get PCI DSS compliance, they actually achieve that by delegating some of the responsibility away and relied on the external provider. I think in their case, it was actually Stripe. So because they needed to be PCI DSS compliant, just quickly, this is a set of security standards that is designed to ensure that all companies that accept, process, or store any kind of credit card information or payments need to maintain a secure environment. That's the gist of it. And like I said, they actually achieve that by relying on an external provider such as Stripe. So the third and the last story here is from the finance industry. So that's another SaaS business that's operating in finances. So shortly, what they were offering low-cost payment tools or platform, funnily enough, via the QR codes for merchants. So it's quite similar to what we briefly talked with the previous customer, but this one was kind of operating for merchants. So for example, like if you go to a food stall somewhere, on a food market or a Christmas market that will probably sprawl up soon enough, they would actually use the tools and payment platform from this company, and via the QR codes, they would provide payments directly. And the challenge for this customer was actually, because they were dealing with the transactions directly, they actually needed a level 1 PCI DSS compliance. And just quickly, what the difference between level 1 and the rest of the levels, which are 2, 3, and 4, is the rest of the levels, you can literally self-assess by filling out the PCI DSS self-assessment questionnaire, whereas with level 1, you actually need to hit a specific number of transactions. So I think the limit is around 6 or something million transactions through the credit card provider. And you need to adhere to a yearly report on compliance from a qualified security assessor. So it cannot be self-assessed. It's done by a qualified person coming from not necessarily from PCI DSS, but for a company that's actually certified to do that. And there is a quarterly network scan as well by approved vendors. So it's quite a heavily involved process, and they actually needed to hear that. So because they wanted to grow, and adding each customer or each tenant made them really like almost bleed money, because they were paying a lot of money to external payment service provider. They literally switched from Stripe to an alternative payment service provider, which wasn't as expensive, but it didn't give them the whole payment experience, which they needed for L1 anyway. So what they ended up actually is they, like I said, they switched the payment provider. They went and implemented the missing bits. So the missing functionality that this provider didn't provide. But, that actually lowered the cost per transaction, and it made them scale easier and better by onboarding new clients. And even though it increased the compliance burden from them, it's actually made it more and more sustainable and scalable for the longer run. So as you can see here, there isn't one fits all or one approach that would solve all the problems. Sometimes you actually want to increase the compliance burden, and it makes things easier for you in the long run. So let's kind of refocus back on running in AWS. How can AWS help you become compliant or stay compliant? So first of all, as you're probably all aware, or most of you are aware on this call, there is a separation of responsibilities when running on AWS, which doesn't necessarily transform and respond or mean separate teams. It can mean the same teams, but there is a strict separation of responsibility within your teams and also in relation between you and AWS, which we will kind of dive into more detail in the next slide. But within a single stream of work, different people can have different roles, and the separation of workloads from the platform. For this case, you might use AWS as a platform, or you might build a platform on top of AWS, but you still need to have a team delivering the platform, and you need to own the final product yourself. So definitely, using managed services lets you make, security and maybe some other concern somebody else's problem, in this case, AWS's. And there are a lot of, foundational services that can help you with that, such as AWS organizations, IAM, CloudTrail, Security Hub, and make use of AWS managed components is definitely a big plus here. There are also AWS partners that can help you with the review process. So we have well-architected reviews and also foundational technical reviews that's our latest thing from AWS, where you can go through a preset of questions and a questionnaire and get assessed based on the good practices and guidelines from AWS and industry as well. So if you quickly have a look at the shared responsibility model, if you run your workloads on AWS, there is a kind of a strict split. So AWS is responsible for security of the cloud. So that means everything from compute all the way to databases, networking, and storage. And it takes care of the global infrastructure. That means, availability zones, regions, edge locations, and things like that. But everything above that, the customer is responsible for. So security in the cloud, that means, client-side data, which usually involves encryption and integrity authentication, server-side encryption, network traffic protection, and all the way up to customer data is responsibility of the customer, in this case, a SaaS business running on top of AWS. So while working with the shared responsibility model, there are some implications. So as part of working with it, there are a couple of guidelines or steps from AWS that is really good to be aware of. So first of all, you need to determine external and internal security and related compliance requirements, and you need to consider employing AWS Cloud Adoption Framework and what are high-tech best practices. So in this case, partner network can really help you. And then you move on and progress with reviewing the security functionality, configurations, evaluating the security, identity, and compliance services. And at that point, companies usually start to kind of involve maybe even third-party audit attestation or start documenting things and getting a little bit more formal. And it can take you all the way up to performing a well-architected review, which is a really kind of good start of starting to get compliant, and it always kind of uncovers a really good kind of things that might be forgotten. And definitely, like I said before, the partner network is really here to help for that. So in AWS, security, identity, and compliance is taken really, really seriously, and they put a lot of energy and time into it. So as part of that, the AWS does ensure out-of-the-box data protection for all of the services. If it's not turned on by default, there's definitely an option to enable that. There is a strong identity access management, network appliance protection, threat detection, and continuous monitoring. But for our talk here, what is important, there is also a compliance and data privacy section as well. And it's definitely worth to have a look at the official documentation as part of that. So as part of the AWS services goes, as you might be aware, there are over 200 services that AWS provides on AWS Cloud. But there are a couple of them, or few of them, that are very good candidates as strictly related to the compliance and data governance and security. So first of all, it's GuardDuty. It's a service that we usually really recommend to our customers, which is a really good value for money. It's really easy to turn on. It's fairly cheap. And it delivers great value because it would automatically kind of warn you about suspicious activity in your AWS account. Then Amazon Inspector, which is a really good way to kind of analyze application security. Next one that I would like to mention at this point is AWS Config, where you can set up predefined or custom defined configuration rules that would detect compliance or detect non-compliant or compliance violations in your AWS workloads. And that directly relates to the compliance topic that we're kind of uncovering here today. Those tools all operate in kind of the detection area, whereas for example, Amazon Macy is a machine learned powered tool which can actively look through your bucket data at scale and analyze for and actually discover and protect any kind of leakage or suspicious activity as well, and which is a really good way of protecting your data and really improves your data governance as you go along. And of course, there is also the whole the whole category here, which is compliance. So in this case, you have AWS Artifact and Audit Manager as really good helpful tools to kind of get you compliant or help you achieve compliance earlier or even prove your compliance. Okay, let's move on. So as I mentioned before, there are a lot of services, but we as a Scale Factory, we have been helping customers to deploy multi-account layouts as far back as customer has been wanting to help with AWS from us. And this was always something that we recognized as an important building block of AWS. So at this point, all of our business with firms is using AWS or looking to migrate. And our usual recommendation, also coming from well-architected review, is the AWS Control Tower, which is a really the easiest way and really kind of streamlined way of get set up and govern a secure, compliant, and multi-account AWS environment, which as a SaaS company, I think it's a fundamental and paramount to kind of start building your environment with. It's a really nice way to delegate all the complexity of running a multi-cloud environment to Amazon. And it really nicely automates provisioning and vending out your new accounts and keeping them, compliant and protected by all the guardrails that, come out of the box or that you might implement yourself as well. So we would definitely not recommend having a team build something and then walk away. It's definitely better to kind of embed the understanding of AWS landing zone into the team, such as platform, and in this case, using Control Tower would really kind of leverage that and utilize that much better. So as I mentioned before, another kind of really good partner value here would be, doing our architecture review, so well architected. The architecture review is conducted using the well-architected framework, which also includes SaaS Lens now, which is really relevant to the most SaaS workloads. In this arena, we have over 10 years experience helping clients to make the best use of the cloud and optimize the workloads. And well-architected framework really helps with that, especially the 5 pillars of operational excellence, security, reliability, performance, efficiency, and cost optimization that we found very useful for framing conversations that actually link technical needs to the business value of our customers and SaaS businesses that we work with. So if you quickly look at the well-architected, specifically, let's focus on the security pillar because this is most directly connected or relates to the compliance that we're kind of tackling here today. What I wanted to show is what we most often find during our well-architected reviews and maybe raise a question. Have you thought about it? Or is this something that would concern you? Or do you think that would be useful? So during the well-architected, usually it's about identifying risks and kind of trying to match if that kind of aligns with compliance requirements or good practices that you want to work with. And definitely most of the times it's a very useful exercise, even if, the company kind of ticks most of the boxes, it's still a very useful exercise to go through. So let's have a look at the kind of the top risks that we found. So, the top risk is definitely monitoring usage and cost. This seems to be like the top risk and the driver, but from the perspective of compliance, is what we found quite important is, first of all, how you're classifying your data, which is usually a big compliance requirement if you're dealing with ISO or PCI DSS, for example. And then quite high up is also detecting and investigating security events. This definitely kind of pops up quite high, and also something that might be a little bit overlooked, specifically maybe detection is covered usually, but investigation and maybe alerting is something that people tend to forget or neglect a bit. And then in sense of compliance is how well you protect your compute resources, how well you respond to an incident, and last but not the least, how well do you protect your data at rest, which surprisingly, at least to me, that came as a really big surprise, how many companies still forget to enable encryption, specifically at rest. I mean, usually they're quite good with encryption in transit, whereas it's fairly easy to kind of nowadays, just terminate TLS somewhere on the load balancer and off you go, right? It's fairly easy, especially in the AWS. I think they made a good effort to kind of commoditizing that. But data at rest, it's surprisingly how many companies forget to do that, especially if the service doesn't enable that out of the box, which for things like RDS and S3 is not the case. And in order to be compliant, that's quite an important thing to turn on, especially using your customer key material rather than predefined one. So as I mentioned before, let's quickly have a look at AWS artifact reports. I briefly mentioned it through the list of AWS products that can help you achieving compliance. The AWS artifact is it actually is a repository and provides several compliance reports from a third-party auditors who have tested and verified the compliance with a variety of global, and industry-specific security standards and regulations. So when the reports are released, they are immediately made available in AWS Artifact. It's a no-cost self-service portal where you can just go and access it via the AWS console. And it might help you to kind of demonstrate the compliance of your platform to your auditors, and those audit reports include AWS SOC reports, PCI compliance, ISO, FedRAMP, HIPPA, and the rest of them. So it definitely makes it much easier to, especially if you're obligated to demonstrate the compliance of your cloud infrastructure, it makes it much easier to kind of demonstrate that in front of your auditors or regular reviews that you might be obliged to do. The next thing related to that is also, important thing is how not just how, but also, the need of staying compliant, because, it's usually not enough to, achieve compliance. All the standards usually require the constant review process on top of it. And like I mentioned before, the really important bit here is educating people and ensuring that everybody is familiar with the documentation, where is it at, processes, and also the procedures that kind of come out of that. An interesting one here is as well, ensuring the current state of documentation. I found that quite challenging working with our customers, where creating an initial documentation is, I wouldn't like to say easy, but people tend to do that most of the time. But keeping it up to date is probably a whole challenge for itself. And also being aware that sometimes, or usually, maybe you don't have to be compliant with the strictest standards, such as PCI DSS level 1. And if that's not the requirement, a lot of times you can actually self-assess, which is also quite useful. And in these terms, easily schedulable as well. Whereas if using external people, they might not be available at the time that you need to be compliant. So that's kind of good to keep in mind. Okay, I believe we're kind of closing up, but I would like to kind of really quickly summarize and wrap it up with some of the takeaways from my presentation. So first of all, if you're going to walk away from this presentation, what I would like you to kind of walk away with is right time your compliance project. Definitely manage your compliance that carefully, and be pragmatic about when you start kicking off your compliance project. Like I said, there are different cases. Sometimes it might pay off to do it early. Sometimes it's worth postponing it for a bit, but it really depends, what industry and sector you're working in or who your clients are. Then the next one is the next topic is address the undifferentiated challenges using the managed cloud services. What that means is definitely have a look if there is a managed service that you can leverage and use. In AWS's case, like I said, there are over 200 managed services, or at least services that can help you, start your compliance story from the day one, start the security from day one, and build on top of it. You still need to take some of the compliance burden on you as you build solutions on top of it, but you have a really good kind of steady foundation here from AWS. And then next one, it would be please be aware of over-investing in compliance. And this is another kind of a risk there as well. Like I said before, it can be a burden, but it also can be a competitive advantage. What that means is, over-investing it early on, if you remember the innovators curve, right? You know, early on, it probably makes sense to kind of focus on your product more, and then as you reach the steep curve of the chasm, start investing in compliance. At least start planning it early, and that way it will prepare you better for the growth and expansion that you want to achieve. And last of all, probably I've mentioned it during my talk as well, is there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And as usual in the consultancy business, it really depends, right? So it really depends where you operate and what your targets are, what your goals are, and what delivers value for you as a business. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any kind of questions you might have.